The antinomy of freedom and necessity exists not only for man and the created world, but also for God. The impossibility of solving it has given rise to the doctrine of predestination. If God foresees, or rather if he knows from all eternity whither the freedom with which he endowed the creature will lead it, he thereby predetermines some to salvation and others to perdition. This terrible doctrine ascribes the character of fate not to freedom, but to God himself. God is the fate of the creature, predetermining their salvation or perdition. The doctrine of predestination is, of course, a form of rationalizing the mystery of the last things, and the most revolting form of it. But in any case, hell proves to be fated, whether it is preordained by God or is an inevitable consequence of human freedom. The antinomy remains insoluble, and the inner dialogue of the soul, divided against itself by the painful efforts to solve the problem, continues. It may even be said that the effort to solve it is itself an experience of hell fire. The argument may be carried so far that God himself will be found to deserve everlasting torments. This is precisely what is done by the most remarkable and profound writer of modern France, Marcel Johandu. Johandu raises the inevitable question of God himself suffering in hell if the creatures whom he loves will burn in its flames. The idea of hell is that of an eternal doom, for in hell there is neither freedom nor grace which might lead out of it. It is absolutely fatal and irremediable. Freedom which leads to hell is recognized, but freedom which leads out of it is denied. There is a free entrance, but no free exit. Thus, God's conception of the world involves an element of dark fate, far more terrible than the fate of Greek mythology. This fatal element overshadows the Christian mind and conscience. Hell is, as a special ontological realm, indicates either the failure of the divine plan or an element of fate deliberately included in it by God. It would be profoundly wrong to call that fate a triumph of divine justice, for there is no justice in punishing by eternal torments sins committed in time. Time and eternity are incommensurable. There is more justice in the doctrine of karma and reincarnation, according to which deeds done in time are expiated in time and not in eternity. And man has other and wider experience than that between birth and death in this one life. Theosophical theory of reincarnation cannot be accepted by the Christian mind, but it is essential to recognize that man's final fate can only be settled after an infinitely greater experience in spiritual worlds than is possible in our short earthly life. Hell is the final result of a certain tendency of the moral will and the moral consciousness of mankind. It may be willed and affirmed by those who never trouble about theological problems. Hell, as an objective realm, is the creation of moral will which sharply divides the world into two camps, of the good and of the wicked, into two spheres which culminate in heaven and hell. The wicked are thrust into hell, and it is done in this life and in this time. I mean, quote, morally thrust, for physically they may be the masters. Hell is the result of the complete separation of the fate of the good, who inherit bliss, from the fate of the wicked, who inherit eternal torments. Hell, as an objective realm, is preeminently the work of the good. It appears to them as the final expression of justice, a just retribution. I am speaking here of hell in the objective sense, for, as subjective, it is to be found within the realm, the life of the good themselves, and is an experience known to them also. Human will, which sharply divides the world into two parts, imagines hell as an eternal prison house in which the, quote, wicked are isolated, so that they can do no more harm to the good. Such a conception is, of course, not divine but human through and through. It is the culmination of the life of our sinful world on this side of good and evil. The possibility of real victory over evil, i.e., of the regeneration of the wicked, is not even thought of, and, what is worse, the will is not directed toward that end, but rather to its opposite. Evil must be isolated, punished, and thrust into hell. The good comfort themselves with that idea. No one wants to think of saving the quote wicked and the devil. People do think, of course, of saving sinners, because everyone is a sinner, but there comes a moment when sinners are numbered with the quote wicked, in the camp of the devil, and then they are forsaken and relegated to hell. This separation of the fate of the quote good from the fate of the quote wicked, and the final judgment passed by the good over the wicked, is the greatest perversion of a morality generally acknowledged to be very lofty. It is a mistake to imagine that hell, as punishment and retribution endured forever in some objective realm of being, is the result of divine judgment. This is an invention of those who consider themselves, quote, good. The human, all too human idea of hell objectifies wretched human judgment, which has nothing in common with God's judgment. Quote, true believers send, quote, heretics to hell in accordance with human and not with divine justice. God's judgment, for which every human soul in the whole creation is waiting, will probably have very little resemblance to the judgment of men. It is utterly inadmissible that men should usurp God's right to judge. God will judge the world, but he will judge the idea of hell too. His judgment lies beyond our distinctions between good and evil. This idea may perhaps have found a reflection in the doctrine of predestination. Man's moral will ought never to aim at relegating any creature to hell or to demand this in the name of justice. It may be possible to admit hell for oneself because it has a subjective and not an objective existence. I may experience the torments of hell and believe that I deserve them, but it is impossible to admit hell for others or to be reconciled to it, if only because hell cannot be objectified and conceived as a real order of being. It is hard to understand the psychology of pious Christians who calmly accept the fact that their neighbors, friends, and relatives will perhaps be damned. I cannot resign myself to the fact that the man with whom I am drinking tea is doomed to eternal torments. If people were morally more sensitive, they would direct the whole of their moral will and spirit toward delivering from the torments of hell every being they ever have met in life. It is a mistake to think that this is what people do when they help develop other men's moral virtues and to strengthen them in the true faith. The true moral change is a change of attitude toward the, quote, wicked and the doomed, a desire that they too should be saved, i.e., acceptance of their fate for oneself and readiness to share it. This implies that I cannot seek salvation individually by my solitary self and make my way into the kingdom of God relying on my own merits. Such an interpretation of salvation destroys the unity of the cosmos. Paradise is impossible for me if the people I love, my friends or relatives or mere acquaintances, will be in hell. If Bohème is in hell as a, quote, heretic, Nietzsche as a, quote, antichrist, Goethe as a, quote, pagan, and Pushkin as a sinner, Roman Catholics who cannot take a step in their theology without Aristotle are ready to admit with perfect complacency that, not being a Christian, Aristotle is burning in hell. All this kind of thing has become impossible for us, and that is a tremendous moral progress. If I owe so much to Aristotle or Nietzsche, I must share their fate, take their torments upon myself, and free them from hell. Moral consciousness began with God's question, Cain, where is thy brother Abel? It will end with another question on the part of God. Abel, where is thy brother Cain?